I think it could be understood in many ways. Like first of all, like especially in some of the examples that I showed in the Torvald project, that the playfulness comes from when we are being faced with an abundance of a specific material that we don't know what to use for. Like, what do you do then? Because if everything else we do is about introducing as little as possible, and suddenly we have a lot of waste that we don't want to throw out, then we have to get the best out of it. Like, what can be useful? And then you have to come up with, more playful ways to utilize it. So for example, all the steel that we found, this car wreckage facility that could crush it all into cubes, that's not necessary to do that to make a table, but that was the easiest and simplest way for us to just utilize all the steel that was left, and it made some quite interesting furnitures that we couldn't have predicted beforehand. So I think that's one way to look at it. And the other thing the more that we're starting to utilize the existing materials, the less of the economy in the construction process will be directed into consumption of materials, and more of it you'll be able to direct that into labor. So in the Danish context, it's more or less 50-50. So right now you pay 50% for the materials, 50% for the labor. But I can see that's different in the projects that we have done lately. So that we are paying more for the labor, the total sum that we're doing for the materials. And I think that's interesting, because then you can start to pay more attention to the craft and to the handling and to the care. And then you can allow yourself to use less materials, but also more undervalued materials. And then imbue that with a lot of quality, because you're giving it a lot of care from the people that work with it. To me, that's a more interesting way to use the resources in the architecture, instead of just buying the most expensive material you can find on the market, and that makes it to give quality to the architecture.
So essentially, by having 50-50 material and labor, you are making better use of material, so you're shifting, let's say 30-70 over to the labor side, so essentially you're kind of valuing the input that people have. I mean, that's also an interesting concept, because here at Grace Farms, Sharon Prince, who's our founder, during the construction process, she was here every day and she was watching everything. She was wondering, where are all these materials coming from? What's all this, where are all the materials going? So we began thinking, who's making all this stuff? What's the labor that's happening with that? And then hence, through that process, after the building was finished, she started looking into it, and hence the Design for Freedom initiative started here. It's really focusing on the labor portion, and in this context, it's about eliminating forced labor or child labor out of it, so that you can make it more sustainable in terms of not just material, but also the people who are being utilized to make it. So there's a value in the person. So I see that there's also concurrently, you talk about global discussion about shifting how the construction and architecture is made, but it seems to be on different levels, there's this shifting that's happening, understanding more that people also bring a lot of value to the process. It's just we have to just find the right economic models to make that happen.
Yeah, but I think when you one of the first questions you had is that instead of focusing on new modern materials and modern technologies, and going backwards, but I actually think it's a combination of the two, because you have to focus, it's not, for me at least, it's not a nostalgic way. So now it's all about craftsmanship, and now we should imbue materials with the same amount of care as we did in the old days. It's just as much as to direct resources to, for instance, researchers that can play around with the materials in different ways, and they can understand it in different ways. So also in Venice, for instance, we had this whole team from the architecture school in Copenhagen going there to do 3D scannings of the whole pavilion. And based on their scannings, we were able to be way more precise about what to keep and what not to keep. And we had the team of engineers from the Danish Technical University who was doing all these various types of scanning methods, so they could look through all, from the walls to the the slab, everything. They could see what was underneath, what was inside. They could, by doing that, they could tell us exactly where do we have rebars. Like there's a reason why the floor cracks somewhere and where it doesn't. But instead of us having to demolish the floor in order to find out where it's healthy and where it's not, they could look through the whole floor and say exactly here you need to cut parts of the floor away, and here you could keep it. So suddenly by spending some of the resources on them, we can even use less material. So it's also about, it's finding the benefits from the more modern technologies as well as the forgotten technologies, and then combine them.
So efficient use of resources, of the knowledge that people bring in, gives more resources in other areas. And so that's what you're saying is shifting the conversation, because in the construction industry or in architecture, it's very hard to shift the discussion, right? So you're wanting to make like these new models and understanding how to do that and give people the opportunity. So in essence, that's the way you're going to shift it, not just telling people this is what we need to do. So that's what you're searching for. That's like what your playfulness and joy, it's like, how do you shift that conversation?
Yeah, I think there are many things we're searching for, but again, I think it's still for me. It still comes back to the question about the materials.
Yeah.
Because the reason why we now talk about labor and different types of technologies, because it's different ways to understand materials better.
The essence.
The essence or like the properties. I think those two things are they are related. So I think this is what fascinates me, and I think there are many like architects and also engineers in the past who have been better at doing that than we are today.
So the movie touches upon the project in Finland, but I imagine filming was really at the beginning stages. What happened after that? Like, where's the project now? Where are you bringing that?
It's actually, I think one thing that has been interesting about the project in Finland, and also some of the other projects, has been that there's always this part of the project that is kind of like a research project where we don't know exactly where it's going. And in Venice, we initiated this collaboration with the German researcher in bio-based materials who's doing his PhD in bio-based materials, Julian Christ. And he was doing all these tests where you saw with the sand and stone and sodium alginate, gelatine, agar, a lot of different types of bio-based materials. And then after that, he was continuing his research, trying to figure out how to bind different types of plant fibers together without using glue. And we thought that was interesting, so we started to collaborate with him. And we actually had an exhibition last year in Copenhagen where we were doing these tests with hemp fibers and wood fibers, and then the wood's own binding agent, which is called lignin. So you just heat it up and then it can bind itself together without having to add any toxic glue. And then we were trying to go see how far we could go with this research to do a real kind of like a particle board without having to add any glue. And then in the meantime, we figured out that there is a bigger industrial player in Finland who is doing the exact same research, but of course on a larger scale. And
so in the Torvai, you had those wood panels.
Yeah, but that was actually, we had those panels, but we had to add glue to those.
I see.
In order to succeed with this. And this was initiated, this whole interest, because we thought it was interesting that we could take a lot of construction waste and turn it into valuable components again. But again, it seemed a bit wrong that in order to do so, we would have to introduce a lot of resin.
Right.
Like toxic materials, and mix that up with wood shafts. So it didn't, there was something wrong about that. And then we figured out there was this Finnish supplier, and they already found a way to heat wooden particles up and introduce the wooden's own binding agent, lignin, in liquid form and meet the standards of our current system. So they were way further in their research. So we reached out to them, and now we're having a collaboration with them where we're trying to see if we can, again, and this is it's in the early stage, I don't know how far we'll get with this, but to take all the wooden waste and shred it all up, because we're going to do a new roof, and then make all the wooden elements that we're going to use in the house from our own wooden waste through that process, but without having to add any glue. And we're still in yeah, we're still in the middle of that process. I don't know if we will succeed with it, but it's just, I think this is a good example on how something starts in one project, and then there are parts of the thoughts that we like very much that we continue to develop in the next project, and then suddenly it finds its way into a third.
Now